All right. Thanks everybody for giving up your Saturday morning. Um, so we're going to do a couple of things today. We're going to we're going to go over um, adulthood is kind of like this, it's a really long span of time, and we're going to hit pockets of it as we go through. Uh, I've got some slides on Boodle. If you want to, you can have, use those or have those or whatever you if you like to, if you're a slideshow person, you can grab those if you like. Uh, I'm going to go off them loosely. I'm not going to like go off of it like, slide by slide, but I do kind of over time. It seems like people, I've got some students that love having slides and some that don't care. So I just put them up there so you can grab them if you like to. Um, so we're gonna go over a couple of pockets of adulthood. I'm going to talk about some specific clinical things um, that I think are kind of prevalent right now. And if we have time, I've got another case study that we can do that's more, it's actually more young adult or emerging adult kind of stage relevant. If we have time, we'll do that. And then I think in the email or the message I send everyone, I usually like to have, like this last class, I like to have a chance for people to just ask questions. And it could be obviously about, you know, things about the class, but it could be anything. This is a lot of information. The book it's a really good book. It's just really long and there's just a ton of stuff in there. And it's really difficult to cover um, like in one 10-week session. So sometimes people have questions about, as you're reading, you might think of something. And so I usually try to set aside time to answer questions about anything that you have that's gone that you're kind of thinking of. Um, there's an interesting study that was done. Um, I guess it was last year, talking about information and synthesizing information. And for a long time, it as probably the last 10 or 15 years, maybe 20 years, we've had more and more information available to more and more people, which is not a bad thing, except that that's a like when you have a lot of information, but you don't synthesize it well, and then you're not able to break it down and then use it in the right way, then you're just getting information. You're just getting, you know, overloaded. So if we're able to get as much information as we can, that's not bad. What's even better is if we can synthesize it and then break it down and then be able to talk about it, which I am finding in the therapy space, at least in my experience, that being able to synthesize mental health um, information is becoming more important when I work with clients. Not educating clients per se, but being able to synthesize information enough so that they can understand like a concept about something. Because there's a lot of information that's out there that might not be right about something that they're experiencing. Um, and so when I'm saying all that to say, there's a lot of information in this course. There's a few courses that you're going to take that's just a ton of information. Um, but this one's like definitely just turn the fire hose on and just go. So I do want to take time to synthesize as much as we can um, as we kind of walk through it. I go through the book myself every couple of semesters, and I learn new things too. I mean, there's always new things that are happening that we're discovering, but also as you read something again, you kind of see it differently and you think about it differently. And then as you start working with people, then the information that you have becomes even more important important, and then you start thinking about things differently too, which I think is just kind of part of the progression of becoming a therapist. You just kind of you're learning how to do therapy, but you're also learning how to take in information, synthesize it, process it, and then help someone kind of, make their own sense of it. And so, um, I just want to take time to do that with everyone. So having said that, um, I'm gonna go over a couple of things with with everybody, and we can break down adulthood kind of like adolescence. Like there's early or young adulthood, middle, and then late. It's kind of an easy way to think about it. There's actually a couple of interesting things that are happening in the older adulthood area, like 60 plus area, that are kind of fascinating, um, and kind of sad. But for before COVID, that age group was not overtaking other age groups in terms of like addiction, but fast approaching other age groups in terms of percentage, which is kind of fascinating and sad. The second thing that's happening now, and I've had I don't know 10 or 12 of these clients in the past 2 or 3 years, is the popular word is gray divorce is the popular word, but it's basically people in their 60s plus or maybe 30 years plus marriage getting divorced, which is in essence a process of decades of just kind of distancing themselves, basically, is what's happening. And that's one of the things that's going on right now as well, which is kind of interesting. On the young adult side, you have um, less the statistics for marriage are shrinking, and for having children, that age number is getting older. So those two things are happening at the same time. And these aren't like my numbers. These are things that have been going on for a little while, even before COVID. I say pre-COVID, post-COVID, because COVID did definitely have an impact on a lot of things in our life, but some things it didn't. I mean, it was some things were already happening. Like the average age of marriage right now is around 27 or 8 for men and around 26 for women. That's on the average. The average age of having children is around that same age too, which is fascinating because 50 years ago it would have been much younger. Um, and this isn't good or bad. This is just what's happening. And those statistics in America also mirror a lot of what's going on in the world too. So this isn't just something that's happening in America. It's happening in a lot of places. And so you can kind of read that however you'd like. What that also means is that you have what you're going to have eventually, probably, is you're going to have parents that are going to be a little older when they're having kids, which is, not necessarily a bad thing. Uh, but you also have more now. Now, this is a small percentage, a smaller percentage of people that are deciding to not have children, which that number has been increasing a little bit as well. Probably lots of reasons why. We don't have a ton of time to go into all those things. But I'm bringing this up because clinically speaking, you're going to start having more folks that are coming to you that are maybe either struggling with some of these things because the the social perception hasn't changed, as in you go to high school, you graduate, you go to college, you get married, you have kids, you get a job. That has been because we're a pro-natal nation, which means pro-kid, right? It's pushed to have a family, and that's been around for a long time. But what happens when that's delayed, or you don't know if you want to do that? So you're gonna start seeing more people that are kind of like off schedule, quote unquote, from that. That's going to start happening a lot more. Um, and on the opposite end of that, you're going to start having more folks struggling with why they're still married. You know, um, if you work with individuals, you're going to have this. If you work with marriages, you're going to see it, and it's just something that's going to happen. Um, I've worked with both men and women in the later, like, 30 years plus of marriage. I had one that was 45 years, and they were like, I don't know, is this, I don't know if we want to be married. And again, there's probably lots of reasons behind it, but uh, that would be actually be a pretty fascinating piece of research, because there's starting to be some studies about it coming out now. Having said all of that, when we think about young adults, when we've come out of adolescence, so we're kind of past the 18 or 19-year-old um, age, we get into what's always traditionally been that college age. So, 20 to, from the early to late 20s, massive things are happening in terms of their life. Like, whether they go to college or not, they're usually always probably finding a job of some kind, going to school, then finding a job. And still the pretty much the majority of people are still looking for relationships. And that is part of it. Part of that developmental phase is that romantic relationships do start to become more important too during that um, young adult or emerging adult time frame. And so the other thing that's happening is, neurologically speaking, we've started with this idea of self as a kid, as a child. We moved to the identity, which stretches through adolescence. By the time you're 25, 6, or 7, that identity is a little easier to see because your brain is more fully, on board, and all parts of your brain are kind of functioning at this point really well. And so by now you kind of have, your own kind of set of beliefs that you kind of start to follow, and they may or may not match the belief set that you came from. Um, and there's still some thinking about it, but it's a little bit more solid for you, so that when you get into your 30s, by then it's pretty set. Like, your values, your set of beliefs are fairly set. Now, things like that can shift and change for sure, depending on experience, and depending on uh, environment. Look, whatever environment you're in, that type thing. I mean, things like that can change and shift, but your basic personality, like kind of who you are, doesn't change a ton from then on, unless you really, like, if you really wanted to change your personality or aspects of your personality, you could. You'd really have to want to do it, and you'd really have to work at it in order to do that, which is a very different idea than 100 years ago. The old thought was that your personality is actually set by the time you're like 3 or 4. That's like, this is who you are, and that's it, and there you go. And that mindset's actually carried on in a lot of ways, because you're going to work with clients that might be 30, 40, 25, that are basically coming in with the mindset of, well, this is who I've always been told I was, right? And you acted because I did this when I was 10, and then maybe I did it when I was 12, and so therefore this is who you are. And that's not really helpful to them, because that's we're not really who we were at 10, I don't think, hopefully not. We're probably different when we're 25 or 30. Now, there could be aspects of our personality that are definitely different, for sure. Um, and there could be aspects of our personality that are similar than when we were 10. That could be true too. But when we work with people that come in with this fixed idea of, like, well, this is who I am. I mean, this is who I am. This is, kind of how I've been treated. And then you're like, well, what about these other things that you've done that don't seem to point to that's the only person that you are? Um, I've worked with uh, I've worked with a lot of clients that definitely feel um, trapped by, things they were told at certain ages, basically, that this is kind of who you are. This is, This is all there is, kind of thing. I'll give you an example, and this is a clinical example, but it's just personal to me too, just in my life because I've got a senior and junior in high school, and our house kind of ends up being a place where a lot of their friends come. So we talked all, we hang out with all of them and talk to all of them. And um, I've worked with I've worked with four generations of people now, teenagers, and the one thing that you can see, and you can read it in the research, and if you just live it, you can see it. Any one of you that's worked with kids long enough, like the same age kids long enough, you know that who they are now is not who they're going to be, right? I mean, the way that like I've got, there's friends of my kids that I'm like, man, you are so annoying. And then 10 years from now, they're awesome. They're great. You like hanging out with them, right? I mean, that's what happens as we develop. And then there's other kids that are like, oh, you're so easy to hang out with. And then that's kind of who, you don't, who you are at any given time is not necessarily who you're going to be. And that's the nature of development. But when we have clients that come in and think, well, this is who I am. So um, another example would be I've had many clients, mainly couples, when they come in, and this could be either partner could say this, um, you know, and they'll tell you, you know, some people don't like how I talk to them, but I'm just being honest. In other words, this is my free pass to be an ass to people because I'm just being straight with you. Now, what you might find is that maybe that's how they grew up, or maybe something happened to them somewhere that kind of made them a little harder, and they're just trying to hide something. And I'm not saying that being direct with people is bad. There's nothing wrong with that in the right setting. But when you and your spouse are having trouble and you're struggling to communicate, then you don't need to probably act that way with people. But that's just like in someone's mind, it's like, well, this is who I am. So I don't need to change. And then that's when we start talking about, okay, then you start talking about what you'll talk about in other classes. Well, how do you help someone like that? The reason why we're talking about it this way clinically is because there's probably things that have happened in people's lives that have led them to who they are now, right? There's Our behaviors don't just come from nowhere. Our behaviors come from something. And it's probably a little, we talked about nature and nurture a little bit. It's probably a little bit of both. It's probably a little nature, a little bit of nurture. There could be traumas in people's past. I mean, there's lots of things that potentially could have happened to them. Um, and, and so I think it's important for us to just have this idea of, okay, like who they are is not necessarily who they're going to be. That's really help. I feel like that's helpful in the therapy world, I think. It doesn't mean that you won't get frustrated at times or anything like that, because you will. At the same time, it's also important to remember, like, okay, someone's behavior or their thought pattern or how they process and experience emotions or how they react to things, that's coming from somewhere. It's not just like made up. There's reasons why people do the things they do, which is why you have a full textbook of theories about human development, right? We have spent decades trying to understand why people do things and why we behave the way we do, and we have lots of theories about it, right? And so that's the other reason why this class is important, because you get an introduction to all of those, theories about human development, human behavior. Because it's going to pay off for you when you're sitting across from people. That's why we do it. And so I think, I just think there's some things that we have to keep in mind when we work with people. And one of those to me is always like, hey, there's reasons why this is happening. There's reasons why maybe you're struggling with certain things. If you can find out the genesis of it, that's great, but you might not be able to with everything. It doesn't mean people can't make adjustments or change or do something different. You can always do that. The one thing that we know neurologically is that our brain is very elastic and it can actually be fairly flexible late into life, like even 70s and 80s. It's still not as elastic as it was when you were 20, but there's still some elasticity to it, which is kind of fascinating. And they're really learning a lot of interesting things using MRI technology to kind of see how flexible our brains are. You can actually continue to learn and grow and change later into life, which is a lot different than what we kind of first thought. Uh, Now, there's some things that you need to do in order to do that. You can't, there's some things if you don't do that you won't be as elastic, right? Um, so there's some general things to think about in terms of like, you know, how we as people can stay, our brains can stay elastic. It's trying to learn things is one of the biggest ones, which means usually means reading or learning something new. Um, the physical activity is tied to that, your sleep is tied to that, your nutrition is tied to that, and your relationships is tied to that. And so all of those things are really, really important. Now, when you start working with people, depending on the age group that you kind of settle on, because some people like certain, age groups, uh, you probably will start seeing similar patterns in the people that you work with, most likely. And so it really helps to kind of, in my opinion, and this is one of the reasons why I give the assignment the way I do. I think it does help to know as much as you can about that, you know, that stage of life. That'll really help you too. Okay, now, this thing's driving me crazy. Here we go. Okay, there's a couple things I want to talk about specifically. I don't know how much time we've spent talking about. Let me get to the right place here. I don't know how much time we spent talking about like addiction and substance abuse. I don't think we've talked about it a ton. I want to talk about that really quickly because because that's something that starts become more evident into adulthood that can have its roots in adolescence, but can really start showing itself into adulthood. So there's just a couple of basic principles to think about. Now, we have an addictions class that'll kind of dive into this a little bit more. But there's a couple of principles that are important. Our brain has what's called a hedonic set point, which is this kind of uh, normal line, like pleasure line, basically, of tolerance. Uh, you know, this is kind of like um, my set point is based on, how much tolerance I have of like a, a substance, an alcohol, of sugar, caffeine, all those things, right? And so when we engage in something pleasurable in terms of a substance, and this is true for sugar, caffeine, nicotine, then any type of drug or alcohols, right? So when we engage in that, it feels good. And the feeling of feeling good is the pleasure that comes from the mid part of our brain, which is what produces, and dopamine is produced. And dopamine is kind of the feel good neurotransmitter. There's serotonin's part of it, but dopamine is really powerful. And it's part of the reward center of our brain. So, like, I'm a huge Snickers person. I've always loved Snickers. So if I eat a Snickers, I mean, I'm like, yeah, I mean, I'm gonna, like even now thinking about it, like if you think about your favorite food, you're like, I probably should need a lot of this. You could start salivating even. Like it starts, you start thinking about it more. Well, that's because dopamine's like, here, let's get ready for this because this feels good. We're going to do it. Um, if you do it enough, what will happen is that hedonic set point will start to rise and go up, which means you have to use or intake more to get to what you would feel is normal, right? And that's why people that let's transition to like drugs and alcohol. If we think about drugs and alcohol, things like methamphetamines, any of the amphetamines like meth and coke, those are going to be like almost instant. Methamphetamine is one of the closest things to almost instant addiction, as close as we can get. Nicotine's probably the other one, but when you take on board um, meth, you get instant pleasure that feels so good, and then of course you crash instantly. And one of the reasons why it's so addictive is you have to use a lot of it to keep feeling good. Heroin's different. Heroin or pot are more like depressive type drugs. They last a little bit longer. You don't have to use as much. They're still as just as addictive. Alcohol the same way, but your set points basically your pleasure threshold is rising and rising and rising. And so if it was down here and then all of a sudden it's up here, you have to use enough to feel normal, which means you're building tolerance and you're having to use more. So that when you get up here, eventually you'll have other consequences to that that'll happen to you. The hard part about it is when you're younger and you become addicted, your consequences might be a little less. As you get older and more responsibilities, your consequences are tougher, right? And the hard part about addiction in general is that relapse itself, like if you get clean, this idea of relapse is really a rule, not an exception. The average is 3 to 5 relapses before reaching sobriety. So on a scale, if we think about a scale of like an addiction scale, like the only true way to fully remain sober is to not use it all. That's the only real way. Unfortunately, as we get older, we want to, there's the natural either urge or just kind of curiosity is to experiment. And when some people can experiment and that's all. And then they don't go for very far on that continuum. They might just move a little bit and they experiment and that's it. Other people experiment and think, well, I'm going to use a little bit more. And then maybe it becomes more of a habit. And then all of a sudden that habit becomes tolerance and then maybe potentially some type of abuse so that they're far away from sobriety, right? And some people, that's how they are. Now, I have definitely had clients that have shut that down cold turkey and moved all the way back to sobriety. That's not very many, but I've had clients that have done it. Most people can't just go all the way to back. They have to have help to get back to sobriety of any kind, of whatever that is. And that's really because what happens is in our midbrain, where the reward center is, where it lives, is because you have the dopamine rush and then you have glutamate that comes on top of it, which kind of solidifies memories basically. So it solidifies that pleasurable memory. And that's what you're trying to reproduce, the feeling, the kind of chill thoughts. If someone has a lot of, let's say someone's struggling a lot with really bad intrusive thoughts, when you can be high enough, you don't have, intrusive thoughts, let's say, or, anything that's going on that you're trying to avoid potentially, that will help you avoid it. Um, so much so that the midbrain is also where our basic instincts for living are found. like procreation, eating, sleeping. Like these are things that are like part of who we are. It becomes so much a part of who we are. We There's a point that we could get on that continuum that we think if I stop using, I'll die. Like I have to have it. Even I've worked with people that have even know and they're know rationally that that's not true. Like they know that they need to stop, they need to get help, but there's a part of their brain that's like, no, this is you have to keep going. You can't stop. Now, there are some health factors, like say with alcohol, people that are um, heavily into abuse, it is dangerous for them physically to just stop cold turkey because there are actual biological things and physiological things that will start shutting down. They could have seizures, their organs could stop. I mean, there's things that they need to do medically when they that's why if people that maybe have been alcoholic for a number of years, they'll go through medical treatment first, then they'll go through whatever type of recovery. And again, it just depends on we're talking about like how long and how much and how often all those things matter. But that's the other reason why people relapse is because going from where you were out here to back more this way is really hard because of the overwhelming recovery symptoms that you have when you're going back to because you're lowering your tolerance basically because you become dependent upon it. So this is when I was working at Texas Tech. I taught at Texas Tech, and I taught an addictions class, and we talked about this was an undergrad class, so it was like mostly freshman sophomore. I had some juniors, but mostly freshman sophomore. And we used to talk about binge drinking in there. That was one thing that we talked about, and we had a binge drinking assessment that we would give out. And of course, people, some students would be like, "Oh shit, I'm binge drinking," because binge drinking is five or more drinks, two or more times during the week. Well, that's kind of for some people that's college. That's your college career. That's what happens. Some people, like I said before, some people can go through college and maybe do that off and on, and then after their college, they're fine. But there's just another percentage of people that do that in college and don't stop after. They will continue that, and that will continue to happen after college. And so uh, those are just again, you're gonna have there's a whole other class on this, but um, one of the reasons why it's harder to stop if we start something early in like late adolescence. One reason is because our stop system is our prefrontal cortex. So you can think about the midbrain and the dopamine center, the reward center is the go system. The go system is way more powerful than the stop system, even in adulthood. The stop system doesn't have enough power to stop the go system. You have to do things to stop that go system because once it's engaged and going, the stop system can't stop it because it's too powerful. One of the reasons is you know, if we think about it in evolutionary terms, the midbrain is the oldest part of our brain. The prefrontal cortex is kind of newer in terms of development, but that's also where where our executive functions are housed, and we kind of know already it takes decades for those executive functions to mature. And so once they're mature, it's a little more helpful. But that that addiction kind of cycle has ramifications across multiple parts of our life as well. And so that's just kind of like that's a 10,000-foot overview of kind of what happens to us. And so you potentially could have clients that have come in, and as you're talking to them, and they're talking about like on all my intakes that I do, I ask questions about um, uh, specifically about marijuana, alcohol, and any illegal drugs. I ask specific questions about it, like if they use it, how much or when, that type thing. Most people are at least say something. It's not uncommon for people to underreport things. In other words, probably say one thing, but maybe they're using it more. That's pretty common. It's also common to be in a session with people, maybe two, three, four sessions in, and so you start to think, oh, I think maybe something else is going on. There's something else happening, and you start asking questions, and you find out, well, yeah, I drink probably 20 or 30 beers during the week. Well, that's a lot of beer to drink during the week. Or yeah, I had a client one time that we were just talking about different coping patterns, and um, at one point she said, well, because we were talking about like the difference between like positive coping, negative coping, and how it can impact us. And at one point she said, well, I guess I probably shouldn't drink, the full bottle of wine every night. I was like, well, I mean, yeah, it's probably, if you're drinking 3 or 4 bottles of wine during the week, that's 4 pours. And some wine has more alcohol per serving than beer. I mean, yeah, that's probably smart. But but there's people that don't think that that's hindering them. You know, I can tell, like, let's take caffeine for example. I had a client that was he worked on oil wells, but he moved around. So he wasn't like with one crew. He kind of did different things. Kind of had a specialty job. And he came to me because he was stressed out and he was tired, all the things. And I talk about sleep with everybody. He was talking about his sleep. He's like, I can't sleep. I'm not sleeping, and I'm eating okay, but I'm working. Of course, he was working a ton of hours too. And I said, well, what's your, is like, how much caffeine do you have? Caffeine, because it's not uncommon for people to drink coffee throughout the day, or things like that. I mean, that happens. He said, well, I drink 2 liters of Dr. Pepper every day. 2 liters. All right. I said, so you drink like 2 liters of Dr. Pepper? He's like, yeah, maybe not that much every week, but I was like, so you're taking all the sugar, first of all, that's a ton of sugar, and all the caffeine. And so I was like, well, no wonder you're up. I mean, no wonder you're up all the time. And so we kind of talked about that, and just we slowly but surely he kind of took himself off of that and not moved that down. And then it turned out he had some other things that were going on too, that we were able to actually kind of work on. But when you work with people and you start to pick up things that you're like, okay, this sounds interesting. Probably just you kind of learn to follow your instinct about it and kind of find out things about it. Um, the new interesting thing that's also been happening probably the last probably 20 years is that there is a movement to be a little more health conscious, like what we eat and drink and things like that, and how much we exercise, which I think is awesome. Um, at the same time, our obesity rates haven't changed that much. Like there's certain things that haven't changed that much. So again, there's lots of information out there. Not a lot of synthesizing of information. Some of the information is obviously not good too. I mean, there's bad information too that's out there. So, okay, let me take a step back for a second. Any questions about any of those things? I've talked straight for 40 minutes. I didn't really mean to, but I did.
I do have a question, Dr. Beddard,
Yeah,
about your conversation about addiction there. And
yeah,
so there's like a lot of, I mean, over the course of my life, I've seen people talk about addiction being a disease, especially with those who've suffered from addiction or know someone impacted by addiction versus people who haven't had that impact in their lives saying it's a
hmm,
choice and like
yep,
this is not, we shouldn't treat it as a disease. And obviously I subscribe that it is, but but no one's ever really explained what makes it a disease specifically. And I was just like wondering like if you can share anything about that
yeah.
so we can
So,
like help quantify that.
yeah, sure. I think that debate is going to go on forever because there's always going to be people that think it's a moral problem, right? We should just pick ourselves up and stop. So one way to look at it would be, okay, I've got diabetes. and I don't take insulin. Probably going to die because I got a kidney disease, right? I've got something going on. I have got three of my arteries to my heart are clogged. Don't care. Not going to do anything about it. Going to die. I got heart disease. The brain's not different, I don't think. Okay. If you get to a place in addiction where you can't stop something, not because you don't want to, because you just can't. The reason why people don't, the reason why people, I think, have trouble thinking of it as a brain disease, because that's what it is because the consequences and the symptoms of it are so bad that look so easy to change. For example, why would you not quit? Why would you, um, why would you start stealing money from someone to support this? You know that stealing's wrong. And that's a symptom of addiction, right? Um, People go through horrible, hellish things. Their families do, their friends do. That people, some people end up homeless. I mean, there's significant things that happen to people, and it's kind of like in your mind, it's not logical. Like it doesn't make logical sense. So I would say, yes, I think you're right. It doesn't make logical sense. Why would someone be homeless? People don't choose to be homeless. Like someone in addiction, if they're in addiction, their mind is not the same as it was before the addiction. It's different, right? The moral argument of pick yourself up by your bootstraps has been around for a couple of centuries now. Basically, ironically, since uh, so opium used to be prescribed for people with alcoholism, right? Laudanum was something that was used for headaches in the late 1800s, right? Um, the full movement of prohibition was really a temperance movement, a religious temperance movement that basically what people began figuring out is at the time men mostly were not working and things were happening and they blamed the alcohol. So they said if we take away the alcohol, then that stuff will stop. But it made it increase. It made it all worse, right? But the idea is that we see the outcomes of addiction and we think these are so bad. Why can't people just stop? Why can't you just stop that? Well, it's the same reason why I can't stop my heart from being bad, or I can't stop myself from having diabetes. I can't cure my diabetes by just now. You can make it better. Yeah, your diet can make it better, all those things. But that takes a lot of strength. Willpower and white knuckling does not work in addiction in the long term. It just doesn't work. Now, what I'm saying right now, listen, I this argument is going to go on forever. This is going to be argued forever until you have someone personally uh, impacted by it. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh shit, maybe this is different than I thought. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
No, that totally makes sense. My only devil's advocate response to that, and I'm just trying to carry the
Yeah,
conversation is, because I agree with you on everything you're saying, obviously, is that, the other person might say something like, well, it was their choice to start this path. Like they
totally.
picked
100%.
and
100%.
mm,
100%. But when did we go from you tell me when it went from my choice to I can't stop? Where is that? I don't disagree with any. It's always our choice to start anything.
right.
100%. I don't disagree with that at all.
Mhm.
Addiction, the
But
nature
that's
of
not the
addiction,
argument, right?
the nature of addiction means you can't choose.
Right.
Can I
Right. No
step in?
matter how we got there, the point is that we're there now. And And now we're in the disease
And
phase of this,
at some
basically.
point, we have to say, okay, yeah, all right. So let me just say this. Okay, yes, we it was my I chose at one point to do this or not do it. That's 100%. What the hell does that matter now when I can't I cannot keep a job and I can't do, I'm living in my car and I'm, or whatever. And some people are functional. Now some people are functional in their life and can work and appear to be fine and have families, but they're just eroding inside, and does it matter at that point to me? And I know you're just being devil's advocate. I'm just saying this is what I would say. Like at that point, it's like, okay, awesome, great, I agree with you. Now what? Like I'm in the business now of like, what are we going to do about it? Let's do something about it. I want to help somebody, and that's why I'm giving you the information about. Here's what's happening. Your brain right now has your hedonic set point has gone so high that this is your normal now, and we got to bring that normal here and then here and then here. We can't do that by saying, well, you should have just thought about that before you know did whatever the thing was that you did. There's a reason why relapse is a rule because it's so because it's so powerful, right? Does that make sense? I mean, it's a great question, Mark.
Can I jump
This is
in?
this is always this debate's going to go on forever. What you're
Yeah.
asking now is going to go on forever.
Can
Yeah,
I jump
sorry.
in? I've
Yeah,
I've been
sure.
in recovery since I was 18 and I'm now 58.
Yeah,
So I work with people in recovery,
yeah.
specifically women. And I started drinking very, very young.
What, 14, 13?
Um, 10,
Yeah,
cough syrup,
yeah.
because it made everything better.
That's right.
Um, and this is the way a lot of times I explain it to women is that when I take a drink, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if I'm going to have one. I don't know if I'm going to have 20.
Right.
I have this physical, when I start drinking, I can't stop, just like you were talking about.
Yeah,
Well, then just stop. But the other part is I have a mental
right.
disease, which means that my brain tells me that I don't have a problem.
Yeah.
My brain tells me it's going to be different this time.
Because your brain wants to repeat
Right.
what's
Right.
already
So
happened.
it's the mental part, because if it's just a physical, well, then just don't drink.
Yeah.
That's the easy part. Just don't have another Snickers bar,
Yeah,
you know.
right. Yeah.
But the mental part is that my brain tells me that it's going to be different, it's going to be okay this time, and then it isn't, and it's just a cycle, and it goes on and on. A lot
Yeah.
of people who come in, they haven't had the consequences, but their body's dying.
Hmm.
There's a lot of people who've come in who didn't have consequences until they were 60 years old.
Sure. Yeah.
There's just such a difference, but it all goes back to that mental part of, because we do have the physical, but it's the mental part that's the crazy part. That's the part that you have to work with, because that's the part that tells you it's going to be okay this time.
But also, Lynette, you have a good point. I really appreciate
Uh,
you bringing this up, and I really appreciate you sharing this.
oh, you're welcome.
Here's the other thing.
Hmm.
Now, if you don't go into a treatment, like if you don't work in this area, that's fine. It takes a certain person to work in this area. You have to treat not just the addiction, but Lynette just said it. It made everything feel better. Well, now, what's that about? That's what you also need to treat, right? You have to be able to say, well, I go back to what I said before. People don't start drinking cough syrup at age 10 for no, that's like, now someone might look at that and go, oh, I'm going to take a drink. And it's like, oh, I don't like that. And then move on. That 100% happens, but not people that are like, I don't like this feeling. And when I do this, I don't feel this way. Therefore, huh, that's easy. 1 plus 1 is 2. I'm going to keep doing that. And then all of a sudden, well, the cough syrup didn't work as well this time. What works better? Right. And so that's part of the mental part. Well, the comorbidity was what it's called, or a dual diagnosis. anxiety, depression, whatever the things are. That's if you don't treat that too, then you're going to have trouble down the line anyway. Lynette, does that make sense? Yeah.
100%. Because I have a lot of women, that I work with that have trauma, like as a
Right.
child or
Right.
teenager.
Right.
And this was their solution to
Hmm.
not having to deal with reality. So a lot of times, they'll come into, because I work a lot with AA and different, and they'll come in and I'll see, look, this is more than just working this program. You need to see a trauma therapist.
Yeah.
You need to I had to do that. I had to work on what was going on
Yeah.
with me. I had a lot of OCD,
Yeah.
anxiety, things that
Yeah.
back then it didn't, you were just crazy
You were
kid.
you were just quirky.
Yeah, And so, but that's it.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. You have to figure out why, like what started this. And a lot of times
Yeah.
it's than just a recovery program. It's a lot of therapy.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why, and this might be not be true for every single person, but one reason why it's a lot of therapy is because you didn't do any therapy. You used like there. We could talk about this in a different way too. Like let's talk about anxiety for a second. Um, depression's. We could talk about that. Either one. Our brain doesn't know the difference between like depression or anxiety. It's reacting to whatever is going on. And it just reacts and responds in a certain way, right? And people that take, um, instead of taking medication, might use something. So I've had tons of clients that smoke marijuana because their brain just wouldn't stop. Tons of clients like that. But then when you talk to them about, have you thought about taking medication? They don't want to take a medication because they think it's addictive. It's the least addictive pot. I don't care what anybody says. It's not addictive per se, but it becomes addictive because you need it because your brain won't stop. So that's what Lynette brought this up. That's what your brain does. It flips things around on you. And so you might take a medication or drink or something else. People might gamble. Some people shop. I mean, there's some people look at death scroll through their phones. I mean, people do certain things to avoid certain things, right? So I'm not saying this is the only reason why certain things happen, but avoidance is a terrific short-term strategy. It works 100% of the time short term. It is a horrible long-term strategy. It works 0% of the time long term. And let me give you a small example. Um, and this is a personal example with my son struggles with certain pieces of anxiety because most teenagers do anyway. And he sometimes puts certain things off and then he'll try to get out of it. And we have worked with him a lot on this. And now he does a better job of saying, if I put this off, I feel good now, but later I'm going to feel worse. Like he's starting to put that together, right? And I've worked with tons of clients where it's like, hey, if you put something off, let's say you procrastinate on something. We just had a paper due today. If you procrastinate on it, if it's Wednesday and you think I got to turn this in Saturday, but I really need to go do these dishes over here and do these other things, then short term, you're going to feel fine. You're going to feel relief. But at the end of Wednesday and into Thursday, that stress and anxiety is going to come back stronger than it was, right? Because it's really your brain saying, hey, this is something that needs to happen. And so that feeling, that anxious feeling, that stress, Nobody likes that. So how do you get rid of it? Well, you could do something about it and, you know, you could do productive things. Or you could use a substance of some kind. Or you could sit there and watch the next episode on Netflix. I mean, there's a lot. Does that make sense? Like we will do extraordinary things to not feel difficult things, right? Now, if you're 10 years old, that's different than if you're 30. Okay. So one thing that you can think about as you go through training and thinking through like working with people, the more you can help people sit and just kind of sit through something, even uncomfortable, man, that's powerful, super powerful. I give this really dumb example, and I talk about this to my clients too. My form of mindfulness, like we have mindfulness techniques now, and there's strategies you can teach people, and not just breathing. I'm talking about like there's things you can do with people. My form of mindfulness growing up was sitting in the back of a car on an 8 hour road trip. You don't have, what are you doing? You're looking out the window. You had no choice but to sit with whatever boredom, you know, frustration, impatience. That was what you did. We don't have to do that now. You know what I mean? Like we can everyone right now, if you want, if you're like, oh man, I don't know, this is kind of going on and on. You can turn your video off, get on your phone and scroll, or get on your computer. I mean, we have choices now to take us out of whatever that feeling is. Right? Does that make sense? Like we can do that if we can teach people how to sit in some of that for a certain amount of time and realize that it comes and goes. It's a wave. It's not continual. It comes and goes. It's waves. It's like a cloud. A cloud can come over, but the cloud's always moving, right? Does that make sense? So I'm sorry I'm going down a rabbit trail. Mark, it's a great question. I mean, you have a great question. I think it's great to talk about too, honestly.
No, I appreciate the dialogue. Thanks, Lynette, for sharing also. I mean, like it's just like you said, I think it's one of those things that's just going to keep going forever, and people are going to be like, they're going to dig their heels on whatever they school of thought that they subscribe to and all that. But I agree with you 100%. I mean, in fact, just case in point, like last night, my wife and I, we do something what we call 90s night, where we like go out for dinner without checking Yelp first,
Oh yeah,
and like just like actually like let's see what this strip mall joint has to offer without seeing if it's 2 stars or 5 stars, and
yeah,
that's like our
yeah,
way of like of your sitting in the back seat of the car kind of thing, and like not knowing and
yeah,
actually it turns into a very fun night for better or for worse kind of thing.
yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, if you really want to test yourself, um, put your phone down for a week. Don't pick it up. Man, that's hard. You don't need it, right? I mean, you don't need your anything really. I mean, it's up to eat and sleep and drink, water. And you don't not even the phone. You could do. There's other things you could. I mean, there's lots of other things you could do that you could give up and see what happens. I mean, that's. Um, but our world is just it's like, and I said this at the beginning. Developmentally, we haven't changed that much. Our culture and our environment has changed drastically, right? And whether you agree with the changes or not doesn't matter. It's still change. Like it's going to change again. Like things are going to change again. Things are always going to change. The difference is we have. It seems as though we have things that are moving faster and faster than we used to. That's all. And so when we think about this from a developmental standpoint, um, when you become if we get into our 30s and 40s and 50s, and we've most of the time you've kind of found your career or at least a job that you kind of like. I mean, you kind of have a trajectory of some kind, whether you start a family or not. Still, the majority of people are doing that. Um, You kind of have a set group of friends as you get older. I mean, all those things are happening as you, in terms of like your lifespan. One of the unique things that starts happening too as we get into like, especially like around the 60s and above, there's a transition, and Erickson talks about this too. This transition from like, you know, I'm trying to, move forward, advance, do these things, grow to what am I leaving behind? Like what's my like what legacy is happening behind me? So my personal theory about teaching at Amberton, my personal theory is that we have our average age of learner at Amberton is 40. So we have some older, some younger. My personal theory is a lot of the folks that come that this is like in a retirement or kind of close to retirement is that's what they're thinking about. I want to do something for people behind me because it's normal and natural to think about your legacy. We think about that with our family for sure. I'm talking about like, what am I leaving behind? In other words, it's that same need that we had when we were young and little. What what do people see? What I mean, is this okay? Like, am I needed or was I needed? There's a human kind of normal, natural kind of need to be needed and loved and cared for, and that's wired in. That connection piece is wired in to us. Now, some people for sure can do with less interaction. There's if you're really introverted and you don't need to be around, 50 people all the time, then you can be alone and that's fine. There's still a need for connection there with you. Um, but that I think there's just this piece of us that we want to know what am I leaving behind? What are other people seeing? What am I giving back to, other people? And that's a normal part of development as well. And so I've actually done some work with uh, I've done I don't know two or three I've had two or three clients that were kind of like almost towards retirement, working for a company they've been with for a long time, and then there was restructuring, and then they kind of were like they took away some of the incentives that they I used to have, and now my my manager is younger than me. I mean, there's all these things that have kind of happened with them, and they're like 2 or 3 years away from retirement. They don't want to retire yet. They kind of want to work to a certain age. And one of the things we talk about is this. We talk openly about, hey, it sounds like you know, you don't making money was so important to you for a long time, and you've done that. But now you're on this back end. Now what is important? And one of the things we talk about is there something you can do for the people that are just starting in your profession? Like a lot. I mean, you have a significant amount of knowledge and experience. Is that something you can help them with? Now, some of them respond okay to that, and some don't, and that's okay. But that is part of development too. Is as we get older, we do want to share our wisdom, or we do want to share our experience. We do want to help people. Um, I don't know. Does that make sense? What I'm saying? Hopefully, and that is a natural piece of our human development, which can come out in lots of different ways. Work, personal, friendships. It can come out in a lot of different ways. Um, so we talked about a ton of things. Let me take another step back. Any other questions about anything that we've talked about today?
I have a question.
Hmm.
Um, it's more of I want to get your take and a response. So, in my own life, suffering with PTSD, suicidal stuff, and then dealing in my work with first responders, I'm also a chaplain. But one of the, especially when I'm very open about my testimony, my story, one of the large responses that I get, a very common response is, oh, well, they just need Jesus. And even to me, you just need Jesus.
Hmm.
You must not have a relationship with Jesus. And it was my relationship with Jesus that gave me hope with
Sure.
prayer and everything else. But my response to these naysayers about mental health is no, there's more to the conversation. So I just wanted to get your take
Mhm.
on that because with this whole addiction conversation, I think that's another piece that we didn't touch on is the indoctrination of the church, so to speak. I know that's broad, but
Yeah. So I think it's great. I think it's a great question. Um, I mean, the simple answer, I guess, is there's obviously some things that can't be prayed away. Like there's some things that can't be changed just through, like, I'm going to pray about this and it's going to change. That doesn't mean prayer's not important or like your belief system's not important or whether you're, in like in the Christian faith, let's say, belief in Christ is not important. Doesn't mean any of those things. I mean, that's important. You said one thing too about hope. Let's talk about hope for a second. Hope is one of the constructs that if you can help people have hope, it will diminish suicidal thought. That's one of the things that will happen. And hope can be generated too, right? You can help people generate hope. Like Carrie, for you, like part of your testimony might be through Christ I found hope. Well, that's awesome. Well, let's use that, right? Like for you, let's use that. Like what does that mean, right? When you talk about it or when you think about it. And for someone else it might be their kids or there's lots of things that can you can help people generate hope. And help them be safe. If we talk about, suicidal thought, especially because suicidal thought um, is really like specifically if we think about suicidal thought just in and of itself, and this is true from childhood on. You want to say you want to talk to them specifically and be direct about okay, it seems like you're having these suicidal thoughts. Well, yeah, I have. Every once in a while I think these things. Well, have you ever thought about how you would do it? In other words, you're looking for an intent, and then you want to know if it's a fatal intent or not. If those other two criteria are met, you can pray all you want, but I want to get you to an emergency room or I want to get you to somebody. I want to get someone else around you. Does that make sense? Like I want people around you because I'm worried that you have a plan and that plan is lethal. And if those two things are met, then we need to get other people around you immediately. Right. Now, if you don't have a plan and it's not lethal, okay, I still want to get people around you, but we can talk a little bit more about we can generate some hope and some other avenues. And maybe you're just having a really, really bad month or year or 10 year. I mean, there could be like you're in a depression maybe or something else has happened that we need to kind of talk about. And so that's the first thing. The second part would be if people say, well, you just need Jesus or whatever it is, fill in the blank. You just need whatever that is. Um, my thoughts about it are I totally understand that. I don't disagree with people necessarily. Jesus himself was around people for 3 years and people still struggled with all kinds of different things. And he was right there with them, right? I mean, he he never pushed himself on people. He had made himself available to people. And I don't disagree that people need something. I think he also did a masterful job of teaching the people that followed him. Now, there were more than just the 12 apostles that followed him. There could have been 30 or 40 people around him at any given time, right? When he was resurrected, there were tons of people in that upper room. I mean, there's a lot of people there, right? He did a masterful job of teaching people to be like him with other people because he said, hey, I'm not going to be here forever. In other words, you guys need to get your act together because I'm leaving. My home is not here. It's with my father. He talked about that all the time. Of course, nobody wanted to listen to it, but that's what he talked about. He trained people to be with people, to become what's called incarnational companions with other people, right? So I'll give you an example. I think one of the most powerful examples of doing that with people. I don't know if I mean, have you ever seen the movie Forrest Gump? It's one of my favorite movies, right? And there's a scene in the movie with Forrest and Jenny where she comes back to see him, and this is before she goes off again and before she gets pregnant and all the things. She comes back to see him, and they're just walking around hanging out. And they walk by her old house. They walk down the road to her old house, and of course, it's nobody's there. But she had been abused by her father, and I mean, and horrible things had probably happened to her. So she goes to the house and she starts throwing rocks at the house, right? I don't know how many, 5 or 6 rocks. And finally, she just sits down and she's crying. Of course, Forrest, being who he is, he doesn't say anything. He goes and sits down beside her. And of course, the narration says sometimes there just aren't enough rocks. Now, what does that tell you about being with people? That is a perfect example of empathic, being empathic with someone, being with someone, and being, if you want to say this, being Jesus with someone. The action itself, it didn't take her pain away. It just meant she wasn't doing that pain alone, which again is part of suicidal thought. Being alone is really not good. Does this make sense, what I'm saying? Hopefully. I don't know if it answers your question or not.
It does. I just wanted to get your take. I feel like it's been a really, this was before I started my curriculum with Amberton, but
Yeah.
just on the chaplaincy and peer support side, it's been a very difficult fight against my own brothers and sisters that are believers. It's just like that there is more to this conversation than just you need Jesus. So it very much makes sense. And I don't know how this is going to land, but I've really struggled with I I don't want to be a Christian counselor. I want to be a counselor that is a Christian,
Well,
that
yeah,
is
sure.
being Jesus, because it's something about that stigma. And I may be wrong. I mean, I'm new into this program or whatever, but it's that been that kind of battle that I've been going through for the last 10 years
Mhm.
that just kind of has deterred me to the other side. I would rather be Jesus, like you were describing,
Yeah.
than say the words without backing it up with my actions.
Well, yeah, and I don't, Gary, there is a flip side to this, and there are thousands of other people that don't think that. They just don't, they're not as vocal. That's all. Um, I had many encounters with people over the years about just what you're saying, and I've worked with people of other faiths and other religions that have very similar, have very similar thought about their like issues that are going on, that they just need more of whatever that particular belief system is. So that's not only Christians that do that. But our society is more. We live, especially in Texas. This is more. You're going to probably hear more of that here than, let's say, in New York or Chicago or other places. But to your point, I used to rail against it, and now I don't, because I don't have to. Right? I tell people all the time, look, do you want to get help, or do you want someone to pray with you? Because there's going to be some people you're going to go to and they're going to pray and give you scripture to read, and some people need that, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But some people need more than that and need other tools on top of those tools, right? And that's what we're here for. That's why we do what we do. I could give you many more examples of Jesus of in the Bible. We could talk about many more things of examples of people having to figure things out, and not just like, yes, miracles happen. Yes, Jesus cured people immediately. He also cured people over time and also made them do things. He 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 put mud on someone's eyes, and he also had people that were outside the city that he started a cure for them that made them walk, and as they walked they got better. too. He made people do things too and show things too. Besides just like this, all of a sudden I can pray and this happens, this miracle happens, and there's lots of other examples of that, And so my encouragement to you, Carrie, is learn what you need to learn to help people, whatever that is. Just learn what you need to learn to help people. And the training at Amerton, I think, will help you help people in more holistically. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
It does. And I think right now it's just sensitive for me with so many, like I worked for Dallas Fire, and a lot of my, well, that's mainly men, are completing suicide.
Yeah,
Just
I know.
it's been nonstop. And so when I try to share and try to bring awareness, that's been the response is like, no, it's not about the Jesus part. There's more to this. So I was just kind
Well,
of curious
the
to hear
rates
that.
of suicide include Christian
Hmm.
people, Christ believers,
Yeah.
not just. I mean, that's
It
pe-
helps for change when we
yeah,
have the the public and the community on board.
yeah.
And so I just kind of wondered from a mental health perspective what you thought. So thank you for
Well,
sharing.
yeah. PTSD specifically is. It's very. I think it's one of the things you're talking about. I think is hard for people to understand. They know what it is. I mean, they know, heard about it, heard stories, know what. Our world knows what PTSD is now. I think for the most part, but there's still this idea that it's mainly just like a military thing, like this is really just a military thing. It's really not. Um, and so uh, that in and of itself, like learning how to treat that, the great thing to me about mental health, the mental health world, there's wonderful treatments for that. Really, really helpful treatments for it. That um, whether you're whether whatever your belief system is, that can help people. And that's to me, the bottom line is like, how many people can I help? Right. And you're going to, unfortunately, I wish I could say, well, you're not going to fight this. Probably going to fight this. It's probably going to happen. But sometimes what happens too is that in our minds, we think this is so logical. Why don't other people believe this? Well, not everybody thinks like we do. And if it doesn't make sense to people, you know, then what I think is right, right? And if I think it's right, then it must be right. And then we'll confirmation bias the crap out of it. We'll look up our things and we'll figure out that we're right. We'll confirm our bias, right? Which is the exact opposite of what we should do, right? Like people will read the Bible through their own lens, right? We all have lenses. We read everything for not just the Bible, but anything. We have our own lens. Unless we're careful about our lens, we'll just say, "Oh, this is what this is how that story went, and this is what happened." Right? I mean, now we're getting,
No, it makes
yeah,
sense. And thank you.
yeah.
Well, and Carrie, to speak to
Dr.
your original question, though, I also feel like churches are starting to make progress on that mental health is a real thing to be addressed. Like, I feel like when I talk to, like, I know my religion wasn't always great about it in the past, and they've been making progress. And I feel like at least it's a conversation that is being had because for years I think it wasn't even being introduced into the room. And so I have hope that we're going to keep making progress there.
Yeah, the two institutions that work the slowest are academia and religion. They work at snail's pace. And I'll be honest,
Also,
when I was a pastor, this is long ago, I referred people to mental health professionals all the time and didn't tell anybody. I don't
I
really
just wanted
care.
to
I just want
comment
people to
really
get
quick.
help.
Carrie, thank you for sharing that because, like, You know, what really resonated for me with what you said is that you don't want to be a Christian counselor, you want to be a counselor who's Christian. And that hit me really hard because I'm Jewish, my wife's atheist. We've lived in Texas for 8 years, and if you are us living here, it's wild. Like, I mean, it's not, we're still the same country, but you're still in a very different place. And I mean, I go to my non-denominational job every morning, and everyone still bows their head and prays before they start their job together. And I step out the room because I don't identify. And so when I think about these kinds of things, and by the way, of course, I want everyone to do the things that make them feel better. But if we're going to be inclusive, if we're going to be multicultural and still do our jobs effectively, I think that what you just said, like being a counselor who's this instead of being this counselor is, I mean, thank you for even putting that into the universe. So I appreciate that.
But yeah, let me say something about that too. There's a great book about this, and if I had it in front of me, I'd show you. But there's four veins of counseling that you can think about, and it starts from one end of like the religious spectrum to the other. Like in terms of like biblical counseling, there might be people that just go by the Bible, let's say. Then there's Christian counseling, and then there's in pastoral care, and then there's like what we, in terms of like mental health, was what we our vein. The mental health vein, it doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter your religious preference or non preference. We're all people. We need help. So if you want to help people, you will help people, right? And having a holistic approach to people is important. And so I have some clients that do want to talk about include their faith inside of our therapy. And then the majority don't talk about that at all, just want to help with, whatever things going on, right? And I'm fine with all I don't care who they are. Now, I do have a humanistic theoretical bent too. So humanistic theory butts heads with a lot of other religious belief theory too. Because humanistic thought is that instead of all of us really kind of being sinful bad, humanistic theory says, well, I don't know, we're probably good, like we mean well for the most part. And so for me, it matters because I look at everyone and I say, well, yeah, maybe they've made some bad choices, or maybe something's happened to them, or maybe they need help with something. But inside of them is the ability to heal and grow and change. Like I can help them with that. And I have no problem feeling that way. And that also helps me when I work with people that I'm like, man, maybe you're not great. Because, I've worked with some people that have made bad decisions on purpose. Me too. I've worked with a lot of different people, but to y'all's point, when we think about working with people, there's always reasons why people believe and do what they do, always. And if we can help them figure those things out and make changes, we will help them. And really, honestly, it also comes down to the fact that if people don't want to be helped, then they won't get help. That's one of the things that will happen. You know, the people that I work with that seem to do the best are people that really want help or want to change, or they really just want something to help them, and they usually get help pretty much every time. So I don't really, it doesn't bother me about some of the noise, the outside noise of things. And I've worked with plenty of people that would say, yeah, I go to this church or I go to this place and they have these beliefs, but I've talked to them and they didn't help me. Now I'm talking to you. I mean, dozens of people like that do it under the cover of secrecy. And I don't care, whatever. Let's just help them. That's all I care. To me, that's all I care about, you know. And let me tell you something. I appreciate everyone here being able to comment about whatever's going on. That's what this is for. That's why we're here, right? We need to have civil discourses and questions and challenges, and still we can all go out and have dinner after this. You know what I'm saying? Like this is just we're all just people. It's good. So that's a good thing. So I appreciate that. I have no idea what I was talking about next. And that's fine. It's
When
no big
Carrie
deal.
when Carrie was talking, I was thinking of that story where the flood was coming and a boat came by and the guy goes, no, 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 God's going to take care of me. And then,
Oh yeah.
a helicopter comes by and it kind
Yeah.
of makes me think that like we're given medicine, we're giving things to help us. That's whether you're a Christian and like I believe in God, I still need help other than just prayer. And I feel like that's what God gives me, different therapists and medications and doctors and everything else.
Well, yeah, because I mean, I think one of the greatest gifts that any of us could have is the other people that care about us. I mean, that's really important, I think. Okay. Any other questions about anything that we were just talking about? Because I'm going to transition here. Okay. I want to transition to, just threw my whole plan out the window. We're going to transition. Hang on one second. Um, I sent that message out about just, kind of thinking through any questions that you have about anything that we've talked about or that you've read or anything. Is there any questions that you guys have about anything we've talked about or anything you've read or comments you want to make? I do set aside time usually in the class to kind of do that. Is there anything like that anyone would like to bring up?
I have a question. So, as we're like going through this lifespan development, like clearly there's stages that speak to my heart of like, I think these people are going to be ones that I'm more drawn to. Do you find that as people like are at this stage to where when they're really practicing and who their people are, does it stay true to who you think it is? Or are you like, oh, wait, that's actually not who I related to? I
Oh
was
yeah.
took a turn to the left and I had no idea.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you might start down one road and go down a different one, and some people start down one road and stay there too. I think it's fluid. I don't think it's static. I think you definitely change. I really wanted to work with families and ended up working with marriages. I had always worked with adolescents, so I did that too, and then now I don't work with adolescents at all, mainly work with adults. So yeah, I think it can change. It kind of depends on, I think it probably depends on the like the disorder or the issue that you um find yourself kind of like gravitating towards probably, I would say. Maybe more than like the stage. But knowing the stage can help with that too. Like just kind of knowing where people are in that stage can help. So does that make sense? Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think it's bad to find a niche, but it seems the niche is usually more like a disorder or an issue or like something like that versus like a stage of life per se. Um, but finding that I don't think is a bad thing. And you don't have to. I've got plenty of colleagues that are still general, like they see, pretty much anybody. You can do that too. Yeah. Good question.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
Dr. Better, when you're treating a client, counseling a client, and is there a time, like, do you have any tips or strategies or things that we should look for, like when it's time to dip into the life, like the life stage develop, like where they are in their life stages? Like, I mean, it's almost cliched at this point that like, oh, here's some trauma. Let's talk about your childhood. I mean, like when is it should we always like get right into like where they are in their lifespan development in that moment, or like is this something like we should just jump right into, or like like when is it appropriate to tap into their middle adulthood stage or
Yeah,
their
yeah, yeah.
adolescence?
Yeah. I don't know that you would necessarily directly start in any one stage of life with someone, but if as things come out, it helps to know in general what happens during certain stages that you're talking about with people, right? So, like you just mentioned trauma, if something did, let's say trauma did happen in childhood, it's helpful to know, like in general in childhood, these are stages of development. So, something could have been delayed because of that. That's probably helpful to know. But trauma could happen, last week, and I'm 45 and it happened to me, last week. So it helps to know, oh, wait a minute, my whole world's been shifted now and turned upside down. So what I think is helpful about knowing the stages, there's two things. The first thing is just having a general knowledge of like what kind of happens each stage is good. The second thing is knowing the theories that go along with like human development. It's just helpful to know those theories because basically they're trying to not define, but answer the question like, why do people do, like, when this happened, why do we do this? Or why do we think this? Or why do we make these decisions? And those theories kind of give some answer to that. So what I find is when you go back, now you might do this later, like as you go through the program, you might come back later. And even as you're studying for the exam, you might look at some of those theories and go, okay, this one really resonates with me now. Like this one, I really like it jumps out, and this is why. Like attachment theory for me automatically jumped out. Like I just thought it made sense. Now I can talk about other theories that make sense too, but that one to me like kind of spoke to me. So I think knowing a theory really well can help you with all the stages because it basically says, well, underneath that is probably, I think maybe this happened because of this, potentially. Now, unfortunately, you're not always going to know like totally 100% why. And that's frustrating to those of us that are like really want to know, like, why did this, like there are times I'm thinking, I really want to know why this happened, but you might not get to it, because there's so many variables at play. So I think the two things are just kind of having a general knowledge of each stage because something can happen that could developmentally delay that stage. If you're an Erickson person or a PSA person, it's like, I got to really do this before I get to this. Maybe that's one of the reasons why that you're struggling because I can't jump stages till I finish whatever I need to do here. If you're well, not a lot of people are Freudian. That's kind of a little bit outdated. But if you're an attachment person, you're definitely going to talk about childhood for sure. But you're also going to talk about other like secure attachment figures potentially, or if you're working with a couple, you're going to talk about the relationship as the home base or attachment. So just having an idea of that, I think, can be helpful. I really think the the theories are just helpful because it at least gives you a place to start with that question of what is going on, like what is happening here. That's a long answer to a short question. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. And you can ask that question about every class, right? Hey, I'm taking this class. When do I use it? When do I use this and how do I use it? And some of that will make more sense too when you start seeing people. So by the time everyone here gets to like practicum 2, I teach the practicum 2 class, which for most people is the last class. If we ask that same question, you might have an answer to that too. Yeah.
Well, I asked it because it applies. I think this class is so fundamental, and I mean, outside of counseling, frankly, I
Yeah.
mean, we got the biological, the cognitive, emotional, and social aspects of it, so it transcends so much, and
Yeah.
so narrowing it down to counseling is just, I think, a very like, okay, it was like, is it this time? Is it that time? But I get it. I
Yeah.
understand what you're saying. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, you can 100% apply it to it's about people in general, not just people in counseling. Yeah. For 100%. My wife makes fun of me because at one point her and my daughter were having trouble, and this was a few years ago. And I was like, babe, we only have to do this for like 10 more years because she's going through this stage and she's going to be at another stage. Of course, nobody likes to think, oh my gosh, 10 more years, but it's already been 5. I mean, everything goes by fast. But in general, like if we think about the way we develop, it's like, well, we develop slowly, not quickly, right? So we don't usually learn quickly. You usually grow and develop over time. And that's the other thing about development is it doesn't happen fast. It's slow, which, none of us like because we always want things to happen quickly, you know. So any other questions?
I have a question. I did my paper on adolescent suicide because I work at a school where we have a very high achieving school. It's
Yeah.
an IB school. So we have a lot of students who have suicidal ideation, even some who've gone into mental health facilities. So I wanted, to really look into that. But as I was researching, you go down rabbit holes. And I came across a lot of papers on loneliness being this worldwide epidemic right now.
Mhm.
There's a lot of research that's starting to be done on that. And I was thinking not just adolescent, but how would that, like, because I was looking at different stages. Like, when I was a kid, we ran in the streets, we had friends, whatever. Now my students are going home and playing Roblox together, on the computer because they're not together, but they think. And then, I was thinking of adults. We text all the time, but we just don't pick up the phone and call or see each other. And do you think that is going to, like, I was thinking of our mental health and how that may affect our developmental stages.
Mhm. Well, we won't know for 100 years probably, unfortunately, because it'll be slow. Uh,
Because I was just thinking of a, developmentally, I can see adolescent, but then I was thinking even like older, people in middle adulthood, late adulthood, childhood. I saved a lot of papers. Like I just
mhm.
like downloaded them because I
Yeah,
want
yeah.
to read them more. But I was
Mhm.
just thinking because, being in lifespan development and going into therapy, how that's affecting people, are more people going to be going into therapy because it's going to be causing a lot of other issues, or it just brought up a lot of thoughts. And I was just wondering what your thought on that was, on this loneliness thing
Yeah.
that's going around.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, it's a super fascinating area of research, I would think. I don't I have not done any research in the area. I have definitely had clients that have trouble making friends or have trouble that taken a job and moved to a new city and they're struggling because they're lonely and they go to work and that's it. They come home. I've got and they're all a certain age, to be honest. They're all younger and they do struggle with that. Now, having said that, you're probably always going to have the extroverted folks that maybe don't struggle with that as much. That's probably true too. I think here's what I think happened. One thing, this is a theory of mine. COVID was like a crucible. It brought out whatever was there. It's there now. Like we see it. Or it's like something was locked in the closet and COVID opened the door and shined a light on some stuff. Right. On one hand, it's not good because it was like overwhelming. On the other hand, I'm glad we're knowing about it. It's really good to have research on loneliness, I would say right now. I think that's good. I think it's good if we have something happening, let's try to figure out what's going on and see if we can, help with it. Right. So I think that part's good. I don't, I definitely heard what you're saying, like in terms of like epidemic, like loneliness epidemic and things like that. The natural tendency is for us to always blame technology, and I think it's one part of it for sure. Um, I think the other part of it is that um, I tend to lean towards like, okay, if something's happening in the worlds of adolescence, then what are the adults in those worlds doing about it too? So I tend to lean there. Um, if the adults aren't acting like adults, kids don't want to be adults. So I tend to lean that way. Now, having said that, 100% there's things that are happening. The mental health percentage of like depression is going up, anxiety is going up for sure. It's still only around 34, between 34 and 36% of the population. That's a lot, but I'm saying, that means there's still more people that are okay than not, right? But we work in the world of people that aren't, right? We're in that 36% world. So let's keep in mind that, hey, this is still just this amount of people. The majority of people are okay. Why not? Can we get those people involved somehow? Can we get some other people involved, right? Lynette, you work at a school with these high rates. I mean, I don't know your school, but I know the parents that send their kids to your school. They're probably fairly intense. And if you raise kids to think they never do anything the right way or perfectly, then that's what you're going to get. I'm just being very blunt. I'm sorry.
I
Yeah.
have lots of conversations with parents because
Yeah.
this year I'm in third grade. I switched grades
Yeah.
and I have kids who they already know what they're going to be because their parents told them you're going to be a software engineer and this is what
Mhm.
you're going to do. And there are kids from all over the world. So it's
Right.
very multicultural.
Now, and some of that's cultural. And,
Right.
and 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 listen, some of that works fine too. There are definitely that is not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, right? Like I have a significant amount of clients from India, and that's how they grew up, and this is what they do, and they're cool, and they're fine with that part. They got other issues, but that part's fine. Like even arranged marriages, there's still people that are doing arranged marriages and things like that. I have a significant amount of folks from like the Asia Pacific area that's their culture too. Like the cultural part is that high driving, high expectation. That's just part of it. And so that we don't need to say, well, there's something wrong because of this. At the same time, if kids are struggling with being perfect, right? And then all of a sudden they're not perfect, that's also an issue too, right? So you could have a kid, any kid from any part of the world that's always done really well, like A plus, A plus, A plus 4.0, all the way through. They get to college and they get a C. That could devastate their world versus a C student. They go to college and get a C, and they're like, "Oh man, I'm cool. This is awesome. Let's keep going." Or I get you know what I'm saying? Like, if you want to read some studies, read studies about longitudinal studies about students that were valedictorian level students and students that were C level students in high school, and see the success and happiness rates over time. The C students tend to work harder and be happier than the valedictorian level students over time, right? And there's lots of reasons why that is. Now, what I'm talking about and what you're asking is multivariable. I mean, there's lots of things that are going on because some people can handle those high expectations that are put on them and they're fine. They can handle it. It's not a big deal. And some people actually need that too sometimes. But then there's also students and people that's harder for them. And those are the ones we work with mainly. Those are the ones that we are like, oh, what's it feel like to not be right ever? Well, that's pretty tough. It's basically like I got a 98. Well, what happened to the other 2%? Right? Okay. Now we're talking about something specific. So black and white thinking is a cognitive distortion that human beings deal with, right? It's either black or white. There's no gray, right? Um, well, you got 98%. That meant this much was perfect. This much wasn't. So what are we focusing on? So with parents, potentially, we could say, what do we is your focus on the 2% or the 98? And it sounds like they did really well. I mean, you know. But I understand that. But this is multifaceted too. It's just it really and there's a cult and where you're at. There's a cultural component to some of that as well. Now that doesn't mean that parents in America can't be just as high expect. I mean that happens everywhere. That the expectation level can happen anywhere for sure. Um, and some of that's because some people did grow up with nothing, and so they want their kids to have more than they did. I mean, there's lots of things. There's a socioeconomic variable to this. I mean, there's lots of reasons why certain things happen. That's why we work with people and ask them questions because we want to know all the variables. So, does that make sense? I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, it does. I was just kind of the loneliness thing. I was thinking of developmentally for kids because they're just not going and playing, even in class, a lot of times they just don't know how to have a conversation with each other. We do lessons on speaking to each other, how to have a conversation.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
that's you can make $1 million if you start teaching that.
well, like student A asks student B about the weekend,
Mhm.
student B replies, student A can't say anything until, we do these things because they video games and talking to each other about the video game over, and that's it.
So we have more keeping us inside than getting us outside too. And part of loneliness is also not just interacting with people, but it's also a mindset of nobody wants to interact with. Like I'm not important. That's part of loneliness too. And that part of loneliness leads to hopelessness and helplessness. And that's the one we have to get in front of that. Going back to something that Carrie was bringing up earlier, like the hope piece, we have to get in front of that with hope somewhere. I've had those conversations, Lynette, with 27-year-old people. Like, how do you talk to people? And one strategy we talk about is, people like talking about themselves. Just ask them questions about it. At the minimum, just ask questions about them and let them talk, right? I have 27, 32, 35-year-old clients that have trouble talking to people. This is not new. This has been going on, right, for a long time. Honestly, probably what's going to happen is that pendulum's going to swing back sometime. It always does. I don't know when. It could be 100 years from now. I don't know, but it's going to swing back. But if you talk to certain generations of kids, they'll tell you, "Well, I do have friends. They've never seen their face, never talked to them in person, but they've talked to them online every day." When my son says, "Yeah, my friend, blah blah," I'm like, "Hey, can you tell me who that is?" It's Ethan that lives in California. Have you ever met Ethan? No, he's my cousin's friend. But to them, that's a connection, right? That's a friendship, right? So even our terms are changing a bit. Now, what the ramification of that is, like what you're talking about now, that's what research is for, right? That's what we're like, okay. Now, keep in mind that when we talk about research, we can't talk in terms of causation. We can talk in terms of correlation. In social sciences, correlations are relationships. This thing happens here. There's probably a strong relationship between this and loneliness. I don't know that this is causing loneliness, right? This is related to loneliness. Or if we think about it like a regression study, if you see a study about regression, that's predictive. If this happens, I can kind of somewhat predict with a certain amount of certainty this thing will happen. Like if I have a stuffy nose and a sore throat and my ears are full and I have a headache, predicting I have a cold, right? I've got these symptoms. So loneliness and lack of being able to have conversation and you know what I mean? Like now we're saying, I think one of the questions you're asking to me is I've got these symptoms, like these variables in research, we call them variables, right? These variables, is there a prediction that's like, can we predict something? If we can, like prediction lines are like this, right? So there's a line that goes, And the closer those dots are to that line, that group is what is the most stronger predictors. Not 100%, but the closer to one in research, the closer to 1.0. So if you see a research study that says, 0.98, well, that's a really strong predictor of something, right? So loneliness is probably a construct of something, right? Loneliness is probably not just what we need to be looking at. Like, what's loneliness predicting? Which is what I think one of the things you're asking. Does it mean our society is going to end up does that make sense?
Yeah, I was thinking like developmentally, how that would affect, if it's becoming worse, is that something that would affect, adolescence or our developmental stages? That's just what I was thinking. So,
And
yeah,
developmentally, yeah, developmentally, like I said, this might be a 500-year question. We don't change but since our society is changing, yes, evolutionary theory, we go back to theories. Evolutionary theory would tell us that yes, there's going to be changes, like our intelligence quotient, for example, has steadily gone up over centuries. We know that. Biological changes. We are much taller, bigger than we were 500 years ago, right? We just know, like that's like there's been, the trend is always up. So is the trend going to be up now, right? If we have this kind of like epidemic of loneliness, let's say, or something's going on that's breaking connection, in this case, face-to-face connection, if it's only digital connections, what does that predict for? Does that make sense? Now, if we want to have a study, that'd be a study.
Well, and I don't think you can talk about the loneliness without talking about like the role that social media plays in the concept of loneliness. Like how much of their loneliness is loneliness because of what they're viewing on social media as what other people's lives look like. And like there's definitely a correlation, a high one there, especially among adolescents, and I would say early adulthood to late adulthood as well. I think
Well,
people are
that's
struggling
a
with social
yeah,
media through all of it.
that's a human nature thing. Everyone's
Mm-hmm.
struggling with that. We compare ourselves to people all the time, and it's never positive. That's just right. So yes, that's a variable too. There's multiple variables and you can find research in all of these probably specifically. And what's called covariant, like this group of variables seem to be the most related to each other. With
that's
social
what I was
media or
finding
whatever,
with the
those things.
suicide research. That's what I was finding, a lot of those types of articles coming up, which
Yeah.
wasn't exactly what I was focused on. So I thought, well, I'm just going to
Mhm.
save them for later because see what they have to say.
Well, welcome to the world of research because rabbit holes are just a normal thing. I don't know how many articles I've got saved. I've got a certain folder and it's got all kinds of stuff in there. Now, some articles aren't great too, just FYI. Not every article that's published is like awesome. Some of them are like, I don't know. Because there's certain qualities that you need. Um, there's certain parameters that need to be met for something to be a quality study too. Is everyone here or no one taking research methods? No. Okay. If you have not taken research methods, you really need to take that. I've been trying for years to make it like mandatory for every class before you take classes. No one wants to take it, and it's not easy because it's a different language, but it really helps you with all the classes. So I think it's good to take.
I decided to take it my first semester because everybody that I'd like looked online was like, it's hard. And I will say I am glad I took it first because it has given me like a different little spin as I've been doing some of my other courses.
Yeah, I think it should be mandatory before any course, but then no one would start courses. We did that because it is hard. It's not easy. Yeah, yeah. Okay. All right. I'm gonna land the plane. Uh, Obviously, you guys can continue to message if you have questions about anything. Um, uh, can't think of anything else. Um,
You had mentioned you were going to offer some extra credit at this one. We clearly didn't get to that. Will there be any other opportunity to earn that extra credit? The nerd in the room
No,
was going to ask.
no, yeah, we didn't get to it today. I just started doing that recently, and we just didn't get to it today. But if you did it last time, you'll get the points for that. Um, I'm toying with the idea of getting rid of some of the exercises and just doing case studies in place of that, I guess, because I think those can be super beneficial. I like the assignments because it helps you kind of synthesize information as you're reading. But anyway, I I strongly recommend people to keep the book. I know some people rent it and or give whatever, but I think keeping the book can be really helpful because I think it helps you with especially those theories that are at the beginning. It'll really help you with that. The book is also pretty up to date. I think 2022, which is pretty up to date. There'll probably be another edition pretty soon, but he does a pretty good job of keeping it up to date too. Um, I hope everyone does well the rest of your time, and I probably will not see most of you until Prac 2, which you know it'll be here before you know it. Just keep moving, and
Mine was 2024.
2024, yeah,
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 it was,
yeah.
and I enjoyed it a lot. Are we going to have a final, or is it just
Nah,
our paper?
just a
Okay,
paper. Yeah, just a paper. You want a final? I can give you one. I'm gonna make it up. We'll make
for
it up real
extra
quick.
credit.
Hey, I enjoyed everybody, and thanks for your questions and comments and your thoughtfulness, and I appreciate that a lot. And hope you have a good rest of the weekend, and we'll see you when we see you.
Thanks for a
Thank
great
you.
semester.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye, guys.
you.
Do you know when you're gonna have those graded by?
The papers
Yeah.
next week,
Okay.
hopefully by Thursday is what I'm shooting for.
Okay.
That means Saturday. If
Hello.
I say Thursday,
4 to 6 pages, could be
yeah,
15.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Hello.
All right.
yeah.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.